Um, Picture the most formidable military alliance in human history. The nations have gathered together. They have the weapons, they have the numbers, and they have the brilliant strategic minds.
Yeah, they have it all planned out.
Right, and they have an absolute unified hatred for the sovereign boundaries placed upon them. They look up at the heavens, plant their feet on the earth, and declare total, unapologetic independence from God.
They are completely ready for war.
Exactly. And God's response to this massive, coordinated global threat is, well, it is not panic. He does not summon the angels for emergency briefing. He does not scramble to adjust his plans.
No, his response is laughter.
It is just wild to think about. Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Our mission for this deep dive is to unpack a highly specific, very detailed analysis of Psalm 2. We are drawing from the Bible Knowledge Commentary authored by John F. Walvoord and his colleagues.
It is such a great source text.
It really is. Now, many readers of the New Testament know Psalm 2 because it is quoted so often in relation to Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
But our source material brings us back to its gritty historical origin as an Old Testament royal psalm.
Right. Those royal psalms were utilized by Davidic kings for coronation celebrations. And, these ancient coronations were not just polite ceremonies.
No, not at all.
They happened in the face of intense, violent political opposition. You had these surrounding pagan nations looking for any moment of weakness to strike.
That context is key. And as adherents to the Westminster Confession, we are going to look at this text through a specific theological lens. We want to see how this ancient script illustrates God's absolute sovereignty over earthly rulers.
Absolutely. It highlights the undeniable certainty of his divine decrees.
Okay, let's unpack this by starting right where the text starts. We are looking at the human rebellion in verses 1 through 3. We are moving from the joyous setting of a royal coronation to an immediate harsh conflict.
The contrast is pretty sharp right out of the gate.
It is. Verse 1 expresses sheer amazement from the writer. He asks, why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain?
It is a question of sheer bewilderment.
Yeah, because when you think about the math of the situation, why would earthly kings plot a political overthrow that is categorically destined to fail? It is like an ant colony declaring war on a fleet of bulldozers.
That is a great way to put it.
They are organizing their military strength and pooling their resources for an operation that the text says is entirely futile.
What's fascinating here is the specific terminology used in the original text. We are talking about the target of this massive unified rebellion. The source highlights the Hebrew word Mashiach,
which translates to Messiah, right?
Yes, Messiah. And its Greek equivalent in the Septuagint is Christos, or Christ. Now, in the historical context of the Old Testament, the concept of a Messiah was not exclusively an end times figure.
That is a common misconception today.
It really is. Back then, every king who was anointed by a prophet with holy oil was technically a Messiah, an anointed one. This physical act of pouring oil over the head of the new king was a tangible, visual representation.
A representation of God's Spirit resting upon him.
Spot on. So when a Davidic king sat on the throne and obeyed God, his rule was not just a solitary political endeavor. His reign carried the absolute authenticity of God's election and the full backing of God's might.
And that divine backing is precisely why the opposing nations' plans were rendered completely futile.
Yes, they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the battlefield. They thought they were plotting against a human monarch, trying to take advantage of a transitional period in Israel's leadership.
Which, politically speaking, makes sense.
Right. In the ancient Near East, a transition of leadership was the prime time for vassal states to rebel. They would withhold their taxes and launch military strikes because the new king was untested.
But they were not taking a stand against a young, vulnerable politician.
No, they were taking a stand against the Lord himself by opposing his anointed representative. From a secular military standpoint, plotting against a small nation like Israel might have seemed like a calculated, reasonable risk.
But theologically, their rebellion was mathematically guaranteed to fail. They were opposing the unchangeable sovereign decrees of the creator of the universe.
The psychological state of these rebellious nations is illustrated so vividly in verse 3. They are recorded as saying, let us break their chains and throw off their shackles.
They express this intense, burning desire to be free from political control. And if we look at the imagery here, it is visceral. They feel tied down by heavy, restrictive ropes.
They really do. They look at God's sovereign boundaries, the moral and political order he has established through his anointed king, and they interpret that order as intolerable bondage.
They do not see a righteous framework designed for human flourishing. They just see oppressive chains that must be violently broken. And when you look at the world stage today, this human instinct to cast off divine authority is nothing new.
No, it is a predictable, recurring historical pattern.
People still look at the boundaries God has established in creation and label them as restrictive shackles. It is a fundamental misdiagnosis of reality. They think true freedom is found in absolute autonomy, throwing off the rules of the Creator.
And that misdiagnosis of reality is a core feature of the human condition outside of saving grace. The source material explains that the nations wish to be entirely free of the political and moral control of the Lord.
They want to be free of His anointed king, too.
Exactly. They view absolute autonomy as the highest possible good. They fail to realize that true freedom is actually found in submitting to the righteous rule of a benevolent Creator.
Their resolution to break the chains is a declaration of absolute independence. And in the framework of Reformed theology, that is the very essence of sin.
It is the creature attempting to usurp the throne of the universe and declare themselves the ultimate authority. It reflects the doctrine of total depravity, really.
How so? Let's break that down for the listener.
Well, the natural mind is completely at enmity with God. It views His perfect law as an assault on personal liberty. But as we move from the chaotic war rooms of these earthly kings up into the heavenly throne room, the contrast is staggering.
It really is. While the earth is in an absolute uproar with generals shouting and armies marching, heaven remains entirely undisturbed. Here's where it gets really interesting.
The pivot in the text is just brilliant.
The text pivots from the loud, chaotic plotting of the pagan kings to the calm, seated posture of the Lord in verses 4 through 6. Verse 4 gives us this striking imagery, and honestly, it is a bit jarring.
It definitely catches you off guard.
Yeah, because God is not pacing the floor of heaven in a panic. He's not wringing his hands or calling an emergency meeting of the angels to figure out a counter-strategy. The text says he sits enthroned high in heaven and he laughs.
Which is such a bold statement.
It is. Now, when the text says God laughs, my immediate thought is a mythological Greek god on Mount Olympus finding human misery entertaining. But the source uses the term anthropomorphism here.
Right, which clarifies things quite a bit.
Yeah, it tells me this is not about God being amused by our struggles. It is a mechanism to explain his untouchable authority. How does this concept apply to God's reaction in this specific passage?
Anthropomorphism is a theological category that refers to stating God's actions, thoughts, or reactions using human terms. We do this so that finite minds can comprehend the infinite.
Because God is infinite spirit.
Exactly. He does not have a physical human body, vocal cords, or lungs to produce physical laughter. Furthermore, in Reformed theology, we hold to the doctrine of divine impassibility.
Meaning God does not experience fluctuating emotional states.
Right. He doesn't have reactive passions the way humans do. He is never caught off guard or surprised. So when the psalmist writes that God laughs and scoffs at the nations, it is an anthropomorphic description.
It is designed to convey his complete and utter contempt for their evil, futile plans.
Yes. He sits enthroned, which is a posture of absolute security, rest, and unchallenged authority. A king only sits when his enemies are vanquished.
If there is a threat, the king stands and prepares for battle.
Precisely. And from that exalted vantage point, God discerns the sheer, staggering foolishness of their opposition. The source points out that this laughter is not a sign of amusement or frivolity.
It is the expression of divine derision.
The Lord sees the puny rebellion of earthly kings as entirely ridiculous when weighed against his infinite might and unalterable decrees. It is the absolute absurdity of finite dust trying to overthrow the eternal sovereign.
The response from heaven does not stop at divine derision, though. God moves from laughter to a definitive statement of wrath.
The source notes that God speaks to them in his burning anger, terrifying them.
And verse 6 summarizes this perfectly. God says, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. God's response to an international military rebellion is not to open diplomatic negotiations.
No, he does not offer political concessions at all.
And he certainly does not try to find a middle ground with the pagan kings. He simply issues a sovereign decree. He installs his king, and that action alone shuts down the rebellion.
And the location mentioned here is incredibly significant.
I think it's easy to read the word Zion and assume it is just an abstract spiritual metaphor for heaven. But the source gives a very detailed history of the word Zion that grounds it in gritty physical reality.
It really grounds the text.
Can you break down that geographical and historical progression for us?
The history of Zion, as outlined in the text, is quite remarkable. It grounds God's actions in real time and space. The term appears 40 times in the book of Psalms alone.
That is a lot of references.
It is. Originally, Zion was a Jebusite or Canaanite stronghold. It was a physical, dusty city built on a steep hill, considered completely impregnable by its inhabitants.
But then David comes along.
Right. According to 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 7, David conquered this specific stronghold by utilizing the city's water shaft to launch a surprise attack. He took a pagan fortress and made it the city of David.
And over time, the meaning of the word expanded.
Yes. Later on, Zion referred specifically to the temple area built by Solomon. Eventually, the term became synonymous with the entire city of Jerusalem.
And the text also notes that Holy Hill is used as a synonym for this location.
Yes, it does. What we see here is God claiming a specific historical, geographical piece of dirt to establish his earthly representative. God's sovereignty is not just an abstract spiritual concept.
It physically disrupts human politics.
By installing his king on Zion, God is making a tangible historical footprint. In Reformed theology, we understand that God's decrees are effectual.
Meaning they accomplish exactly what he intends.
Right. When he establishes his king on that specific hill, he automatically subjugates those who oppose that king. The installation of the monarch is simultaneously the defeat of the enemies.
The source notes that this was true historically with David and his descendants.
And it will also be true at the end of the age with David's greater descendant, Jesus Christ.
So the Lord has spoken from heaven, bringing the chaos of the earthly kings to a halt, simply by declaring that his king is firmly installed on a physical hill called Zion.
And now, the installed king takes the microphone, so to speak.
He steps up to declare his specific right to rule in verses 7 through 9. But right away, in verse 7, we run into a phrase that often brings up a common theological pushback.
This is a big one.
Yeah, the king recites the decree of the Lord, saying, you are my son, today I have begotten you. For a listener who might be familiar with the New Testament application of this verse to Jesus, they might encounter arguments.
Arguments from groups asserting that the word begotten implies the Son was a created being.
Exactly, a being who had a starting point in time. People point to this verse and say, look, it says, today I have begotten you, which means there was a day when the Son did not exist.
It is a very common misunderstanding.
Based on the historical context provided in the source, how do we dismantle this point of confusion?
The source systematically dismantles that misunderstanding by grounding the verse entirely in its original Old Testament historical context. The decree mentioned in verse 7 refers directly to the Davidic covenant.
Specifically, the promises God made in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 14.
Right. In that monumental covenant, God declared that he would be a father to the Davidic king, and the king would be his son. Whenever a descendant of David ascended to the throne in Jerusalem, God described their new affiliation as a father-son relationship.
Therefore, the expression son took on the meaning of a messianic political title.
Yes. When the text says, today I have begotten you, the word today refers specifically to the coronation day of the earthly king. The word begotten is an extended covenantal metaphor.
It describes the king becoming God's adopted son in a legal, political, and covenantal sense.
Yes, to represent God's rule on earth, it absolutely does not refer to physical birth, nor does it mean the king was created out of nothing on that day.
The newly crowned king is appropriating this messianic title to demonstrate to the rebellious nations his legitimate divine right to rule.
It is a statement of authority, not a statement of biological or ontological origin. When the New Testament applies this to Jesus, it is applying this royal title of absolute authority to him.
Which we will see clearly when we look at the typological fulfillment later. That context changes everything. It frames the relationship not in terms of biology or creation, but in terms of covenantal authority and royal adoption.
And the significance of this status as God's anointed son is immediately clear in verse 8.
Because verse 8 deals with the royal inheritance. A son naturally inherits his father's estate. But in this case, the Father owns the entire universe.
He really does. The Lord tells the king, ask me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession.
This is a staggering reality. This king is inheriting the very nations that were actively plotting his downfall in verse 1.
They thought they could break the chains and establish their own autonomy.
But instead, they are being handed over as legal property to the king they despised. They are just an inheritance waiting to be claimed.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of the ancient Near Eastern world, the way the subjugation is carried out is quite terrifying for the rebels.
What does the source say about that imagery?
The source describes the imagery in verse 9, where the king is told he will smash the rebellious people with a rod of iron. This imagery is highly likely drawn from Egyptian execration customs.
Egyptian execration customs, that sounds intense.
It provides a vivid historical parallel. To understand the gravity of this, picture a powerful Egyptian pharaoh sitting on his throne. As part of a ritual to assert dominance, he would take clay votive jars.
Pottery that had the names of rebellious cities inscribed on them.
Yes, nations or specific enemy leaders, often written in red ochre ink. To demonstrate his absolute authority and to symbolize the total destruction that awaited those who opposed him, the pharaoh would take his heavy royal scepter.
And he would violently, physically smash those clay jars into pieces in front of his court.
Exactly. The text explains that verse 9 describes the very beginning of the anointed king's rule. It is a reign that is initiated by putting down rebellion with a massive crushing blow, just like those execration jars being pulverized into dust.
I want to pause and look at the linguistic nuance the source brings up regarding that crushing blow. The text points out the specific Hebrew verbs used in this passage, ra'ah and napya.
Those verbs carry a lot of weight.
They do. The source mentions that the New International Version, along with the ancient Greek Septuagint, translates this action as rule, resulting in the phrase, "You will rule them with an iron scepter."
But the source argues that the English word rule simply fails to capture the violent reality of the original Hebrew text.
Right, those specific verbs translate far more accurately to shatter or dash to pieces. It is not about administrative governance over the rebels.
It is not about setting up tax brackets or diplomatic envoys.
No, it is about the complete, sudden, and irreversible destruction of their rebellion. It is much like that clay jar turning to dust under a heavy iron rod. A clay jar cannot be put back together once it meets an iron scepter.
Given this terrifying reality of a shattered rebellion, the psalmist pivots to offer these rebellious kings a final, urgent ultimatum.
And that pivot is absolutely crucial to the entire message of the psalm, right?
It really is. The text moves from the declaration of absolute, shattering judgment to an urgent plea for wisdom. In verses 10 and 11, the psalmist exhorts the foolish nations to submit to the king before his wrath is kindled.
So what does this all mean for the listener? We are looking at the commands given to the earthly kings. Use wisdom, abandon foolish rebellion, and worship the Lord with fear and trembling.
It's a call to a complete lifestyle change.
But I have to ask, how can rejoicing and trembling exist at the exact same time? Usually we think of those as totally opposing emotional states.
It is a paradox for sure.
Yeah, you rejoice when you are happy, relaxed, and secure, and you tremble when you are terrified for your life. But the psalmist binds them together as the only correct response to God's sovereignty.
The source analyzes these prescribed religious responses of the righteous. They are being told to lead lives characterized by submission rather than their previous arrogance.
And lives filled with exultation rather than the gloom of their impending destruction.
Yes, they are being invited to switch sides before the iron scepter falls. It implies a state of overwhelming awe. You rejoice because you are under the care of a perfectly righteous sovereign who has secured the universe.
But you tremble because you recognize the sheer magnitude of his wrath against sin.
Exactly, and the unbelievable might he holds. It is a posture of absolute reverence.
But that brings me to verse 12, which frankly sounds completely out of place in an ancient military standoff. The text commands the kings to kiss the son. Are they supposed to hug it out with the king they just tried to overthrow?
It sounds like a strange request.
It really does. Why is a royal psalm suddenly demanding a display of affection?
This raises an important question regarding the specific act of submission demanded here, and the source unpacks a fascinating linguistic mystery to explain it.
I love a good linguistic mystery. Let's hear it.
Well, the word used for son in verse 12 is bar, which is an Aramaic word, rather than the typical Hebrew word for son, which is ben.
Because the presence of an Aramaic word is highly unusual in a predominantly Hebrew poetic text, ancient scholars often translated it differently, didn't they?
Yes, they did. For instance, the famous translator Jerome knew that the letters for bar also form a Hebrew word meaning pure. So in the Latin Vulgate, he translated the phrase as give pure worship or worship in purity.
He entirely avoided the phrase kiss the son.
He did. However, the source argues that an Aramaic term is actually quite fitting and deliberate here. The psalmist is directly addressing foreign nations.
And Aramaic was increasingly becoming the lingua franca.
Yes, the international language of diplomacy and trade in the ancient Near East. By using an Aramaic loanword, the psalmist is making a culturally subversive move. He is addressing the foreign invaders in their own international language.
Issuing a taunt and an invitation they cannot misunderstand.
Exactly. Furthermore, the cultural imagery of the kiss is a well-documented act of homage in the ancient world. The source cites 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 18, and Hosea chapter 13, verse 2.
To demonstrate that kissing, whether kissing the feet of a monarch or kissing an idol, was a physical, public demonstration of loyalty.
It was a sign of submission to a sovereign. It was not a display of casual affection. It was the formal signing of a treaty with one's posture.
That makes incredible sense. The foreign kings are being addressed in a language they would immediately recognize, and they are being told to offer a recognized cultural sign of complete, absolute submission.
They have to publicly bow and pay homage.
And the urgency of this command is directly tied to the suddenness of the wrath that will fall if they refuse. The text says, "Lest he be angry and you be destroyed in your way, for his wrath can flare up in a moment."
The source asks an interesting question about this wrath. Is this wrath coming from the Lord, or is it coming from the newly installed king?
Because the text notes that the nearest grammatical antecedent is the king, the anointed son who wields the iron scepter.
Right. But it concludes that in the context of this psalm, the two persons are entirely inseparable.
That inseparability is a massive theological point, particularly within Reformed theology's understanding of the Godhead and the mediatorial work of the Son.
It is huge. A person submits to the Lord by submitting to his anointed son. If the earthly kings do not submit, the anointed king will destroy them.
Because the Lord, in his angry opposition to their autonomous plans, has decreed that his Son will have the throne. You cannot bypass the Son to make peace with the Father.
Submitting to the Son equals taking refuge in the Lord. Only in the Son is there safety from the wrath of God. This concept of taking refuge in God occurs continually throughout the Psalms.
But here it is explicitly tied to the person of the anointed king. If you want the Father's refuge, you must kiss the Son. The wrath of the Father and the wrath of the Son against rebellion are unified.
Just as their offer of refuge is unified.
That brings us to what I think is the most thrilling part of this analysis. Well, this entire psalm meant one very specific thing for an ancient Davidic king facing a regional uprising in the Middle East. The apostles saw a much larger fulfillment.
A cosmic fulfillment.
Yes, we are bridging the Old Testament historical context directly to the New Testament application. I want to highlight Peter's realization in Acts chapter 4, verses 25 and 26.
The source notes the sheer irony of Peter's application of Psalm 2.
It is amazing. Peter looks at the Jewish leaders, the Sanhedrin, the men who conspired with the Romans to crucify Jesus, and he explicitly identifies them as the pagan kings and nations plotting in vain.
The religious elite of Israel, who thought they were defending God's honor and protecting the temple, are categorized by Peter as the rebellious heathens trying to break God's chains.
It completely flips the script.
The irony is striking, and it shows the brilliance of the New Testament's typological interpretation of Scripture. The source meticulously traces this typological fulfillment through several New Testament books.
To show how the early church understood Jesus as the ultimate reality to which Psalm 2 pointed.
Right. For instance, Hebrews chapter 1, verse 5 and Acts chapter 13, verse 33 apply this coronation psalm directly to Christ's exaltation.
However, they do not apply it to his physical birth in Bethlehem.
No, they apply the divine decree. Today I have begotten you specifically to his resurrection from the dead and his subsequent ascension to the right hand of the Father.
Furthermore, Romans chapter 1, verse 4 tells us that Jesus was declared to be the Son of God with might by his resurrection from the dead.
So the resurrection is the ultimate cosmic coronation day. It is the moment the Father publicly vindicates the Son, declaring his absolute victory over sin and death.
And installs him on the heavenly Zion, the true and eternal holy hill. The resurrection proves that the rebellion of the crucifixion was entirely in vain.
The source goes even further into the New Testament, pointing to Hebrews chapter 1, verse 6.
Regarding the Father bringing the Son again into the world, this is a direct reference to the second coming of Christ.
And from a Reformed perspective, the application here is crystal clear. The second coming of Christ will mean absolute, unmitigated wrath for all who continue in the rebellion against God.
And against his anointed king. It will be the final, terrifying fulfillment of the iron scepter, dashing the clay jars to pieces. The kings of the earth will find their autonomy shattered.
But simultaneously, it will mean immense joy, perfect peace, and eternal refuge for all who, by faith, have submitted to God's ordained plan.
God's sovereign plan from eternity past is to rule the cosmos through David's greater son, Jesus Christ. The Davidic title of son, which started as a political adoption metaphor for ancient monarchs in Jerusalem, finds its final designation in Jesus.
He is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords.
It is a staggering demonstration of the continuity of Scripture. The local, historical, gritty conflicts of David's line involving Jebusite cities and Philistine armies were orchestrated by God.
They provided the exact vocabulary and imagery needed to describe the cosmic reign of Jesus Christ.
The futile plotting of ancient Canaanite kings against a monarch in Jerusalem was a shadow of the futile plotting of humanity against the Lord of glory.
And just as the ancient pagan kings were given an urgent ultimatum to kiss the sun and find refuge before the iron scepter fell, that same ultimatum stands today for every single person.
The decree of the Lord stands firm. The king is installed on the holy hill. The clay jars of rebellion will be shattered.
The only variable left is whether one will respond with arrogant, doomed rebellion or with trembling joy and submission to the king.
As we wrap up this analysis, let's briefly recap the progression we have traced. We started in the mud and noise of human rebellion.
Looking at the foolish, doomed plots of earthly nations trying to cast off God's authority.
Because they viewed his righteous boundaries as oppressive chains. We then looked up to see God's sovereign reaction, his absolute derision and laughter from the throne.
And his unshakable, effectual decree to install his king on the physical hill of Zion.
We listened to the king declare his divine right to rule and his authority to shatter opposition like clay jars with an iron scepter.
Finally, we heard the urgent call for all rulers to abandon their pride.
To submit with a kiss of homage in the very language of the nations and find refuge in the Son.
Which finds its final fulfillment in the resurrection and future return of Jesus Christ.
So I want you to consider your own posture today. Are you resisting the sovereign decrees of God in your life, viewing his boundaries and moral laws as chains that you need to break?
Or have you found the only true refuge by submitting to the Son?
I will leave you with this final thought to mull over on your own. If the sovereign Lord sits enthroned and laughs at the most coordinated, formidable political and military rebellions in human history, how might that reality reshape your daily anxieties?
About the seemingly uncontrollable cultural shifts, national politics, or personal crises in your own life today?
If he holds the raging nations in absolute derision, surely he can hold your circumstances in his completely sovereign hands. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive on Reformed thinking. Keep reading the scriptures with a theological eye, and we will see you next time.